And I now call Graham Day, who will be the last speaker in the open debate. Mr Day.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the Minister's immediate predecessor, I took 2 electoral bills through the last Parliament. I recall in the course of the second of these, which set the terms for the conduct of the 2021 Scottish Parliament election, acknowledging that we had by no means reached the end of the road as far as electoral reform was concerned. So I am therefore pleased to note the consultation on the topic and welcome the opportunity to contribute to this debate. My abiding memory of that second piece of legislation, the Scottish General Election Coronavirus Bill, was the cross-party consensus we were able to build around the legislation. The pandemic, of course, had focused minds. However, even allowing for that, the tenor of the process was overwhelmingly constructive, despite the fact that for some, the prospect of the election proceeding was less enticing than others. This Parliament has, sadly, in my view, been a more unnecessarily confrontational beast than the last one. But I'm heartened by the tone of today's debate, and I live in hope. Not least of all because we, as the Minister alluded to, as politicians, cannot escape our responsibilities when it comes to encouraging increased voter registration and active participation, nor kid ourselves on that our actions can and don't have a detrimental impact on both. Presiding Officer, the image of politics at a UK level has been badly tarnished over recent times, and I suspect has turned off even more people from voting. Now, we've not suffered from anything like the same kind of issues at Holyrood. Nevertheless, we do, I think, need to be mindful of the nature of discourse we have here and how it is reported and perceived. We cannot, on the one hand, commit ourselves to wanting to encourage greater involvement in the political process, then on the other, act in a way that at least some of those who are seeking to bring inside the electoral tent find off-putting. And whilst we might all draw a little bit of encouragement from a record 63% turnout in the 2021 Scottish Parliament elections, we should not forget the resources that were committed to boosting the postal vote participation. In his ministerial foreword to the consultation, George Adam references underrepresented groups, including young people and foreign nationals, and he's right to do so. But we have all of us as politicians during election campaigns met swathes of individuals who would not be covered by those headings, but who simply never vote, let alone would contemplate standing for election at any level. And we need to consider how we engage these folk, which is where I'm coming from with my point about we as politicians setting the right tone. But turning to the content of the government's consultation, I think we need to be completely open-minded on reform. However, at the same time, we shouldn't rush to change for the sake of it, just because we think something needs to be done or we need to do something. I'm not suggesting for a moment that's what the government's doing here, but I am reminded of a legitimate discussion we had during the elections legislation in the last Parliament, namely the accepted electoral advantage that council candidates whose surnames place them in the early part of the alphabet and they're on the ballot paper have. There were those who outright, from the outset, favoured randomisation. And you could see the attractiveness of that at face value. But when you looked at the very large number of ballot papers which would have to be issued in order to ensure there was no bias of another nature which might inadvertently come into play, then you realise the challenges here. Now, that shouldn't be, of course, an excuse to dismiss what at face value is a reasonable suggestion, but it does illustrate the need to interrogate the pros and cons of any significant electoral change we're considering. Presiding Officer, we've made progress over recent times in terms of expanding voting and candidacy rights, and now, logically, the question of whether 16 and 17-year-olds should have the right to stand for election arises. I've got to admit, I'm personally a little bit torn between the arguments for and against. But on balance, I tend to believe, as I noted earlier, that there is potentially a case for dipping our toe in the water in the form of local government elections. But again, I think this isn't keeping my point about listening to all the pros and cons. Douglas Ross's point about workload at council elections, Donald Cameron's amendment about safeguarding, but then Willie Rennie's views about the Parliament needing to reflect the electorate that puts it here, they're all valid and need to be considered. On the question of banning individuals who have been found guilty of harassment or intimidation of politicians, candidates or campaigners losing the right to stand for election for 5 years, I've got no qualms. I absolutely support such a measure. not least of all because of the deterrent effect and the spin-off benefit of hopefully encouraging people to stand who might not otherwise do so when they read of court cases involving abuse and threats to political representatives. And let's face it, there are sadly far more of those occurrences than attract publicity. And frankly, anyone who believes such behaviour is acceptable has, in my view, no place in elected office. There are a number of other proposals, such as those for home addresses of candidates acting as their own agents, or the listing in which council ward people reside, and I think require, on first reading for me, a little bit more consideration. Turning to Chapter 2 of the Consultation and increasing registration, the fact, as others have spoken about, that 17% of eligible voters in Scotland are either not registered or not correctly registered at their current address is concerning. And I'm all in favour of looking at processes to improve that position. But I do go back to my earlier point. If people don't wish to register or don't see it as a priority to re-register when they move house, then that is a reflection of the importance they place on voting, and we need to reflect on that as politicians. Presiding Officer, there's so much more in the consultation which is as comprehensive as one would hope for that I would have wanted to address, especially in relation to accessibility to voting and absent voting. But I have to confess that at the point of penning this contribution, I expected to be far more constrained in the time I would have available. But let me pick up on Willie Rennie's contribution, typically humorous and memorable on two counts. Firstly, I think I heard him say something positive about the concept of independence. And secondly, in a surely similarly unique occurrence, an 8-minute speech from Mr Rennie on electoral reform and not a single mention of the F-word, federalism. And I know he'll take my comments in the spirit intended. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, let me finish on a positive note. I have every confidence in the ability of this institution to debate and shape a set of electoral reforms which we can get behind and which will improve the processes and the landscape here in Scotland. The debate today has shown that's possible. I look forward to it happening. Presiding Officer.
Thank you.